So how well do you know the heads of state of the world? Let's try a quiz. Can you name the heads of state of Germany, Canada, and Israel? Easy, right? It's Angela Merkel, Justin Trudeau, and Benjamin Netanyahu. Well, you are wrong, at least according to top political experts who would say the correct answers are Frank-Walter Steinmeier, Julie Payette, and Reuven Rivlin. See, political scientists, who are people that get paid to come up with pseudo-scientific theories about how government works, have a technical definition of head of state that is different than the one normal people use. According to normal people, a head of state is just a ruler of a country, as in, African Heads of State Summit kicks off with expectation to launch continental free trade area. But according to the technical academic definition, a head of state is merely a person who acts on behalf of a country, also known as a state, at the highest symbolic level, regardless of how much political power they have. So for instance, in Great Britain, Queen Elizabeth II would be the head of the state, since she is obviously the most symbolically important person in that country. She knights people, she gives out medals, she cuts the ribbon at the new Walmart, while the boring old Prime Minister of Great Britain simply runs the country. Even though the Prime Minister has all the political power, the Queen still symbolically outranks her. So when the Queen and the Prime Minister hang out together, the Prime Minister always bows to the Queen. And when they are at the same party, the Queen always sits at the head of the table, while the Prime Minister sits over here somewhere. This concept of head of stateism originally arose as a way to explain how it could be possible to have a monarchy in a democratic society. It is obviously undemocratic if you have a king or queen actually running your country, but if your monarch just serves as a symbol of your country, then everything is fine. The monarch can be the symbolic head of the state, while a different elected politician can be the head of the government. For a long time, this was how most governments of the world worked, with a monarch as head of state and an elected prime minister as head of government. But after World War I, a lot of countries got sick of having monarchs, so they overthrew them and wrote new constitutions. But see, a lot of these countries also liked the idea of having someone whose job it was to just do symbolic junk all day. So they came up with this idea of replacing the monarch with a ceremonial president. Under this new system, the ceremonial president became the head of the state, while the prime minister remained the head of the government. Today, many of the post-monarchical countries of Europe use this political system, including Germany, Austria, Italy, and Portugal. Israel adopted this political system when it became an independent country after World War II, as did India when it separated from Great Britain in 1947. All of these countries have ceremonial presidents who cut ribbons and visit sick children in the hospital and basically act kind of like kings or queens. But because they are not as glamorous as kings or queens and don't have any real political power, they are generally not very well known outside of their countries, or even inside of their countries half the time. Now, in some countries that use the parliamentary system, the person who acts as the symbolic head of state, be he a king or queen or ceremonial president, has some emergency political powers. So if there is like a dispute in the parliament over who should be the prime minister, the head of state is supposed to mediate and make the final decision. But as far as I know, this almost never actually happens in reality. Kings and queens and ceremonial presidents are usually just rubber stamps who agree with whatever the politicians put before them. So for example, in Belgium a while ago, they had this really uncertain parliamentary election, and it took 4 months for the politicians to decide who should be the prime minister. And the King of Belgium hosted the negotiations at his palace, but he really didn't do much beyond that. Anyway, it is important to understand that this whole head of state thing is just a kind of academic way to classify different types of government. In most countries, head of state and head of the government are not formal legal titles. People in those countries may just regard the president or the prime minister or the king or whatever as just different people who do different jobs. One doesn't necessarily have to be considered more important than the others. But that being said, there are some international traditions that put a lot of pressure on countries to pick one person to act as the most symbolically important head of the state. For example, there is this ancient tradition that whenever a new ambassador comes to your country, he is supposed to hand deliver a special letter to the head of state. The head of the state is also supposed to symbolically open the Olympics of his or her country.
Célébrant les 21e Jeux Olympiques d'hiver.
I declare open the Games of London.
Открытыми.
And I think that's the case with the World Cup too, but I mean, who cares? But anyway, some of these traditions can cause problems if it's not super clear who your head of state is supposed to be. For example, take here in Canada. Queen Elizabeth is legally called the Queen of Canada, but most of the symbolic duties that you might associate with a queen are done by the Governor General of Canada. Does this mean the Governor General of Canada is actually the head of state of Canada and the Queen is something else? People actually argue about this in Canada. Or how about in America? In America, the president does a lot of symbolic stuff, like getting the letters from the ambassadors, but he obviously does a lot of political stuff too. So a lot of people will say that the President of the United States is actually a combined head of state and head of government, although that also makes him sound a lot more powerful than he actually is. Because the United States has this very strong separation of powers, it's kind of hard to say that only one person is like head of the entire US government. President Trump is head of one part of the government, but Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell are the heads of another part. And these days, the vice president often does a lot of the symbolic stuff, so you could argue that he's sort of co-head of state in that way. But then you also have countries like France, which have a US-style president, but then also a prime minister with some political power too. So then it's like, okay, so is the president head of state and then like co-head of government with the prime minister? Things get even weirder in dictatorships, where the dictator is often this crazy loner recluse who hates doing anything in public because he's afraid of getting assassinated. So often the symbolic head of state duties are just dumped off on some random government guy. For example, in North Korea, there is this old guy called Kim Jong-nam who has been the designated head of state actor since 1998. He is the one who does North Korea's photo ops in other countries and stuff. So here is my parting question to you. Do you live in a country where the head of state and the head of the government are two different people? Do you know, without looking, who your head of state is? Is he or she well known? Does anyone care about them? I mean, these days I think one of the ironic things about having a ceremonial head of state is that no one is really that impressed by their ceremonies. Like here in Canada, Justin Trudeau is obviously much more well known and known for being important than Julie Payette. So who would really want to get a medal or a hospital visit from her? It is much more impressive when a busy politician takes time out of his or her schedule to meet with you, rather than some nobody whose only job it is to fake liking strangers. Anyway, let me know in the comments.